Excellent.
Fantastic. I think it's been about 20 seconds, so we'll just jump right in. We're so glad that you're here with us today. We are here today to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln here at Ford's Theater at the hands of John Wilkes Booth. President Lincoln was sitting in our presidential box when he was watching Our American Cousin with his wife Mary and their two guests. And John Wilkes Booth crept in the back of the box and shot him in the head before jumping onto the stage, shouting "Sic Semper Tyrannis," and fleeing out the back door into the Baptist Alley behind the theater where he had a horse tied up and waiting for him. And then he made his escape into Virginia, where he thought he would be hailed as a hero, and he was wrong. So that is about the shortest version of the story that you can get a hold of. But we have a much more complete version of the story from our virtual field trip that we produced with Discovery Education on March 26th. Today's question and answer session is meant to supplement what hopefully you've already watched. And if you haven't, that's fine. We still welcome your questions and hope that you will submit them to us either in the chat feature on YouTube here, which is on your right if you're on your computer, or at the bottom if you're on your mobile phone or device that goes in your hand. And you can also follow along with the hashtag Fords150 on Twitter over the next hour. That's a great place to submit your questions. I've got my handy-dandy iPad, and I will be keeping an eye out for your questions so that we can answer them as we go. During our live virtual field trip on March 26th, at least 350 questions. I think it was much more than that. By the time we had started, by the time we hit hit broadcast on the 26th, we'd received 350 questions, and they kept coming in during the 40-minute program. So we were only able to get to a small handful of them. So this is the next chance that you have for us to answer them live on air. You are always, throughout your entire life, welcome to email your questions to us at education@fords.org, and one of our team will help you find the answers to your Lincoln questions, your questions about the Civil War, about what happened here, or where to find other resources. But for a live experience, we are here for you for the next hour.
Great. So you can watch the archive video of our virtual field trip on our website, and the link is at the bottom of our screen here, fords.org/virtual field trip. And we are also taking your questions on Twitter, as Kate said. So
that is correct. Just so you know what we're doing today, because today is the anniversary of President Lincoln actually being assassinated, and he died across the street at 7:22 a.m. Next morning at the Peterson boarding house across the street, we here in DC are open for over 36 hours straight. So if you're local, please come by. There will be a lot to see on 10th Street. A lot of what's in the theater is the tickets are gone, but you still might be able to get them for the wee small hours of the morning.
And there's no tickets required for 10th Street. So if you want to pop by 10th Street and see what's going on, there's going to be people out and about. We'll be around to answer your questions. We'd be you come join us for this exciting commemorative event.
And we've got Fife and Drum Corps out front, which is about my favorite thing in the world. So if you'd like to see some Fife and Drum Corps, please do come by. And one way that you can participate anywhere in the country is if you hear bells ringing tomorrow at about 8 a.m. time from churches or universities or anywhere, those are in honor of President Lincoln. And what you can do is at 8 a.m. Eastern, you can ring any bells that you have, and then you could be part of this worldwide commemoration as well. We'd really welcome that. And if you don't have a bell, just keep it. So let's get started.
All right.
Okay.
So while you all think of most burning Lincoln questions and Ford's Theater questions, we will some of the questions that we weren't able to get to back on March 26th with our live virtual field trip. So one of the sort of most often asked questions, I think, until people actually get here and get into our museum, is we have a question from Mrs. Harrison's class at Amelia County Elementary School. And they asked, what was the style of gun used to murder the president? So John Wilkes Booth was an actor, and he chose a .44 caliber Derringer pistol. And it was a single-shot weapon. So, you know, when people say this is your only shot, That's really quite literally what. It was really small. It was about cell phone sized. It could fit, just in the palm of your hand. It could fit in his pocket. He probably chose it because it was tiny and he could hide it and conceal it easily. But sort of one of the most bizarre and exciting things about this weapon is because it was a single shot. After he fired it, he fired the fatal shot. He hit his target immediately. The gun was no longer of any use to him, so he dropped it. And it was actually discovered in the hours later, after the president had been moved from the box, and there were people sort of going back through the box trying to find things and clean up and figure out what was going on, starting the investigation. They found the gun just in the box. And so it was taken in as evidence, and it's been in government custody ever since. And if you come to Ford's Theater in person, you can actually see the gun. You can see the Derringer pistol that John Wilkes Booth fired that night. We have it.
One of our rangers here, I think Eric Martin, is particularly fond of talking about how the technology of something like a small Derringer like that could fit behind the palm of your hand, not only did it make the assassination possible the way that it happened, but it, in a lot of ways, is technology that helped the Union win the war. We had, or the Union side of the conflict had superior technology for weaponry, and a lot of people ask, how could this happen? How could he sneak it? How could John Wilkes Booth sneak into a theater with a gun and assassinate the president? There was still the mindset that if you were going to assassinate someone, you would need to come in with a bunch of guys and very large rifles or muskets or something that would be just so much more obvious. But he was able to be very, very sneaky because of this new technology of the Derringer. And because it was only a one-shot piece, there was a very high chance of it misfiring, and a lot of historians speculate that he chose that piece in part because it was going to be the more dramatic gesture. He was an actor with a definite flair for the dramatic in his
quite a flair.
Personal and professional life. We are already getting some questions in from students. We have... Austin asks, why is the top of the theater closed now? I believe he's referring to the family circle.
Oh, yeah. So the family circle was where the cheap seats were. So they were 25 cents a ticket, and they were bench seats. And so they were really uncomfortable, and it's incredibly steep. It's, the pitch of the bleachers are it's really steep. And so back when Lincoln was in the theater that night, that entire section was completely packed full. Packed full. They were squeezing people in. I'm sure people were sitting on each other's laps. It was incredibly tightly packed. When we reopened the theater to the public in the 20th century, we did not open that area up for public seating. And today, we use it for our contemporary theater equipment, so the lights and speakers and projections, and our stage management booth is up there. So that's where they call the show. So just part of opening up the theater to be a contemporary working theater, the family circle no longer was available for seating.
And we are actually in a location that was previously part of the family circle. We are webcasting to you from the boardroom that is up above the stage. You can see our lovely portrait of Lincoln behind us. But like Alex said, it's part of making it a contemporary working theater and a working space. There weren't really offices at the time. There was the Ford's brothers had an apartment adjacent, but just the way that a building was arranged back then was much different. There also didn't used to really be a lobby. So we actually, in only 2009, were able to get one of the buildings next door to be leased out to us so that we can build a modern lobby where you could sell concessions and have a place to sit and get your tickets scanned, because it used to just be the doors went open and the people handed their tickets in and came in, and that was very popular for theatrical architecture in the early 1860s. Yeah.
We have a question on our YouTube chat here from Mr. Buskus. Our Mrs. Gilbertson's class at Keller, Texas. Where was Lincoln shot?
Well,
I actually have a picture here.
Yeah. If they're talking about where on his person he was shot in the back of the head, very close to the neck, and the bullet went up through. It's gory, but it's what happened here. The bullet went up through his brain and lodged behind one of his eyeballs. And another question that we frequently get is if this had happened today with modern medical technology, would he have survived? And I think it's no. I'm not even unlikely. I think that is just no. But in terms of location within the theater, Alex can show you an image.
So this is a picture of the box in which he was sitting, and he and his wife and their friends, Clara Harris and Henry Rathbone, were seated in this VIP box. And as you can see from this image, the box is actually kind of on top of the stage. And part of this is, back in those days, going to the theater was often as much about being seen to be there as it was to actually see the play on stage. So anytime there were VIPs or notable people, they would often be seated somewhere where the rest of the audience could see them just as well as they were seeing the stage. So President Lincoln and his party were seated in this box, which is on the house right side of the theater. And President Lincoln was seated in, here, I'll go back to the close-up one. The way you're looking at it, President Lincoln was seated in the far right chair. So that's the side closest to the audience. And
it's a rocking chair that was pulled from from the Ford's brothers' apartment because they knew that he was coming to visit.
And that's closest to the door that leads into the box. So when John Wilkes Booth entered the box, the president was the first person he encountered. He was right in front of him. There was nobody in between him and his target.
If you wouldn't mind, actually, hi again, everyone. One of the questions that we got in the box is original fact and what is recreated. Something that's sort of interesting about our historic site is that after the assassination, the building was taken over by the War Department and converted into offices because it was a crime scene, and the theater itself was evidence, and there was not a desire for theatrical productions to be put on here again. So things did not stay over the 150 years. And in fact, when it was War Department offices, the entire inside of the building collapsed, killing 22 people in the late 19th century. So this is a site of multiple tragedies. But what that means is, those flags that are draped there they're not the same ones that were there in 1865. Everything had to be reconstructed, largely based on photographs that the photographer Matthew Brady came and took immediately after the assassination. So like the wallpaper and all that is a reconstruction.
But we do know that this is what it looked like because of those photographs, and also because people described things in much more detail than people tend to describe things now. I mean, when you want to remember something today, what do? You take a picture with your cell phone. But back in those days, people would write it down. So there's newspaper accounts, there is diary entries, there's letters describing the colors and where everyone was sitting. So as we look at this picture in the box, the portrait of George Washington, you can kind of see that that's who that is. That is actually an original piece. That was there the night that President Lincoln came to Ford's Theater in 1865.
And Alex, is it true that the frame on that portrait has got a little nick in it?
It does.
And how did it get the nick?
So we believe that as John Wilkes Booth leapt out of the box onto the stage, wielding his bloody dagger, that his spurs got tangled in the flags, and he nicked the corner of the frame of the portrait of George Washington. And so when you come, I'm sorry I don't have a zoomed in picture here, but when you come visit Ford's Theater in person, if you look really closely, you can see a little gouge in the frame that was from John Wilkes Booth's boot. The other original things in the box here that you see, the small little back of the wooden chair, that chair is original to the theater that night.
We believe it's original to the theater that night.
Oh, we believe it's original to the theater
nearly
that night.
certain.
And I think the sofa also. But the chair that Lincoln was sitting in is no longer with us, and the far chair on the left of this picture was where Miss Clara Harris was sitting, and that is not an original piece either.
And we know we're talking to a national audience right now, so if you happen to be Dearborn, Michigan, the Henry Ford Museum is actually who has the original chair that Lincoln was sitting in, so ours is a reproduction.
All right.
We've actually been getting quite a few
good questions.
Yeah, we have quite a few more Twitter questions in. This is a historical thinking question. Why did he want to shoot Abraham Lincoln? Asks Jack Burke's class. So John Wilkes sympathizer. The main reason was that the Civil War had just ended, or the bulk of it was over because
there was a really significant surrender that happened just a few days prior, and that was when General Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia surrendered to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, and that defeat of the Confederacy was hugely symbolic. It wasn't the actual end of the war, but it was the symbolic end of the war, because if Lee and his army were defeated, then no one could continue. So Booth found that to be devastating, because he was very passionate about the Confederate cause, and he really, really, really wanted the South to win.
And he was heard to remark after that defeat, "I no longer have a country." So he didn't even, I mean, like many people, didn't consider himself to be a citizen of the United States. He considered himself to be a citizen of the Confederacy, even though he lived up in this region.
So after that, the city of Washington and the Union in general started celebrating, and everyone was partying, and they were going out late at night, and there were grand illuminations in D.C., and everyone was starting to relax and rejoice because this horrible war, which had been ravaging the country for 4 years, was finally going to end.
And I would add to that even on the Confederate side, there was relief. They were not happy to have lost, but they were very glad that the violence was over, because it was, especially in the South, did not make for a good way of life, be living on the war front.
But Booth was not so easily to be defeated, and he convinced himself that to assassinate the president, and he actually had a greater conspiracy that also included attacking, or his plan included attacking the vice president and also the Secretary of State, and we can talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But so he had this plan to decapitate the Union government, and he really felt that by removing these heads of the Union, he would give the South another go, and that the Confederate troops would be bolstered in confidence, and that he would be sort of the savior of the Confederacy. And he really thought that that's what this assassination would accomplish. So that's what he wanted to do, and that's what he was setting out to do. As we well know, that is not how it worked out.
Should we go to this question that we weren't able to get to live that was submitted during our virtual field trip on the 26th? We actually had two questions that were similar and related to what you were saying. This from Cody at Ryan School. What happened to the others who were targeted that night? And from 8th graders in Burris Lab in Muncie, Indiana, did the other assassins succeed? So these are students that were aware that this assassination was part of a larger conspiracy, as Alex said, to decapitate the government in its moment of triumph. So the other people targeted were initially General Grant, to whom General Lee surrendered. It was initially reported he and his wife would be the guests of the Lincolns at Our American Cousin that evening. As it turned out, they went to go visit their daughter in New Jersey and left town, and so they brought different friends instead. So they were nowhere close.
They were safe
They
and
were
out
safe
of the way.
and away. Yes. And Secretary of State William Seward was attacked in his bed where he was recovering from a carriage accident. Lewis Powell, he was during the war, he was one of Mosby's Rangers, which were known for their guerrilla tactics. They were described to sort of appear out of the mist and attack people, as opposed to the traditional rules of war that were generally followed during the Civil War, where you had these people on this side, these people on this side. You would have sort of an agreed time if we were going to attack each other now, and then when we said that battle was over, everybody went away. This was much... he was part of a group that was pretty...
Vicious.
Vicious, yes. And what we see in the complicated modern wars, where you're not really dealing with traditional armies so much as you're dealing with a group of people who don't have the same rules and honor code like Lee and Grant definitely abided by.
But so the Secretary of State survived his attack. So he was attacked. Lewis Powell did attack him quite gruesomely in his home, but he survived.
Lewis Powell's gun misfired. Remember, we were talking about Wilkes Booth only had his literal one shot. Lewis Powell's gun
misfired.
It misfired, and he wasn't able to get it going again. So he started attacking the Secretary of State in more physical ways, with hitting him with the gun, and he had a knife, and it was very grisly, and it was sort of miraculous that the Secretary of State did in fact survive.
Mm-hmm. And he went on to continue working in government too, which is sort of amazing. So even after this attack, he was not deterred.
No, he went on to purchase Alaska.
Indeed. The vice president.
The vice president, Andrew Johnson, was in his room at the Kirkland House Hotel, which is now the Bright Horizons Daycare Center over on Pennsylvania Avenue. That's where he lived as the vice president. He didn't have really a residence. George Atzerodt was assigned to kill the vice president, but instead he went to the hotel bar and drank up until his appointed time, and then got on a horse and fled, which was fortunate.
Yes, fortunate indeed, because the vice president had no security or anything. So he was sort of blissfully unawares of these malicious intents that were surrounding him. And George Atzerodt ended up getting caught several days after the fact and arrested with the rest of the conspirators. But he never actually attacked the vice president. He chickened out, which is good for history.
Yeah. So ultimately, everybody else who was targeted was okay, in somewhere on the spectrum of okay, survived. Which, as awful as it was that Abraham Lincoln did get assassinated that night, it could have been so much more chaotic if any of the other conspirators had succeeded in their grisly tasks.
We have a question from Ms. Burke's 5th grade class from Independence, Missouri, and they want to know, how and when did Booth get caught? So this segues nicely, as we were talking about his conspirators. So Booth jumped out of the box after murdering the president. He said, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is always to tyrants. So he was telling the full house of audience members exactly what he thought he was up to. And he ran out into the back alley, jumped on a waiting horse, and ran off into the night. He met up with a fellow conspirator named David Harold, and the two of them proceeded on into Maryland, where they stopped at the Surratt Tavern to pick up supplies. And then they proceeded on to Dr. Samuel Mudd's house, because, as many of you might be, did Booth break his leg? He did break his leg, so he had to go to a doctor and get that fixed. So after they stopped at the doctor's house, I think they spent the night there. they continued on, and their goal was to get into Virginia. Their goal was to move as southward as possible, because the farther, deeper into the South, the deeper into the Confederacy that they got, the safer they would be from the Union. But Booth was injured, and they were not making very good headway, and the Union was after them. So immediately, before the president had even passed away, the investigation began, and the hunt for the man who shot President Lincoln began. And so they ended up catching up with him 12 days later on April 26th in Virginia, in Port Royal, Virginia, at a farmhouse owned by the Garrett family. And Booth was locked in the tobacco barn because the Garretts had sort of wisened up. They were like, this guy's kind of suspicious. The Union is the assassin of the president. We don't want him in our house. We don't want him running away. We need to know where he is. So the Union caught up with him. They surrounded the barn. They said, come out with your hands up. And he said, absolutely not. David Harold, who was still with him, said, yes, okay, please. So David Harold surrendered and was captured and brought back to Washington. But Booth refused to surrender. And so the Union soldiers said, okay, well, we're going to set the barn on fire and smoke you out. And they did. And he still refused to come out. And so as the flames started illuminating the barn, and as the soldiers who were surrounding the barn were looking inside, one of them, a man named Boston Corbett, peered through the slats of the barn, and he could see John Wilkes Booth arming himself, loading his gun, getting ready to come out fighting. And so Boston Corbett actually, he said to protect his fellow soldiers, he shot Booth, and he shot Booth in the neck. And so Booth fell, and they dragged him out of the burning barn, and it took him a couple hours to die. And so as he lay there dying, the bullet had severed his spinal column, so he was paralyzed from the neck down. And as he lay there dying, he asked the soldiers to tell my mother I died for my country. So again, we have his, to the end, his identification with the Confederacy, as opposed to the Union. And he also asked the soldiers to hold up his hands in front of his face so he could see them. And he looked at his hands, which he couldn't move because he was paralyzed, remember, and he looked at them and he said, useless, useless. And so...
A dramatic end
for a dramatic
fellow.
Man. But what's sort of really important about that is he realized he failed before he died. So, there was a lot of... controversy about whether Boston Corbett had done the right thing in shooting Booth, because the original intent was to bring him back to Washington alive so he could be tried and questioned.
Yeah.
But Booth knew he failed. Booth knew that his plan didn't work. Even if he had murdered the president, he didn't topple the Union government, didn't give the Confederacy another go. He
was not hailed as a hero the way he thought he would be.
He was condemned as a traitor and a coward, and he failed, and he knew it. So that's sort of...
read about how much of a failure he was in the newspapers that he had delivered to him while he was in hiding, which was a bummer for him, but that's what happens.
Yeah. He was not a good guy.
No. A couple of questions along the same thread.
Okay.
A few people would like to know about Mary Lincoln and Clara Harris. Clara Harris was the friend who was in the box with them that night, and if they were hurt, and what happened to them.
Yeah. So Mary and Clara were unhurt. They, except emotionally traumatized. Mary and Lincoln were holding hands when this happened, and so Mary's heart, she reacted as you would suspect. She was screaming and worried and afraid and sad and frightened, and she followed her husband to the when they carried his body to the Peterson house across the street, and she stayed there all night. And she wasn't at his bedside because the doctors insisted that she stay in the front parlor because she was grieving and hysterical, and they thought that was too much of a distraction. So they kept wife from her husband. But And then Clara Harris was also unhurt, but her fiance, Major Henry Rathbone, so he actually tried to stop Booth as Booth was going to jump out of the box. So Booth shot the president, and then he went to get out of the box, but Major Rathbone realized what was going on, and he got up to stop Booth, and Booth pulled out a knife, and he actually stabbed Rathbone in the arm.
Big old slash from
and
ear to ear.
to the bone. And so Rathbone actually was sort of grievously injured, and he survived. But that night, a lot of the blood and gore was actually from him. And so he finally was able to receive some medical attention after the president had been tended to. And he and Clara, actually, they went on to get married. They had children, but they had a very tragic end. Neither of them really recovered from the trauma of being witness to the assassination.
Particularly Major Rathbone. He definitely blamed himself.
Sad.
Yeah, he blamed himself for not being able to stop it. And if you would like to continue, please go for it.
It's really heartbreaking. He ultimately lost his mind, and he ultimately murdered Clara and tried to kill himself and failed. So for them it was it's a horrible, horrible end.
He believed that there were assassins in the paintings in their home when this incident happened, and so he ended up living out the rest of his life in a German insane asylum because it was clear that it wasn't
he was
a
traumatized.
malicious murder. It was he was not. It was like from the assassination. So. To answer that question in a sort of long way, but an interesting way, is she was unharmed night, but the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, she was ultimately a victim of it as well. Yeah. And really in a lot of ways so was Mary. She's one of the questions we got was how much longer did Mary live after the assassination? She had 17 more years, but they were very much filled with grief for her. As just exactly as you would imagine. So because of this assassination and the fact that she had already lost 2 out of her 4 sons and then would later lose her third son, all 3 died in childhood, she didn't have much of a chance to live the happy and fulfilling retirement years that actually she and Abraham Lincoln had been talking about that day of what they were going to do now that the war was over. They were going to travel. They were going to go to San Francisco. And that did not work out.
So Mary Lincoln had a sort of very sad and heartbreaking remainder of her life. Also, she never went out of mourning, so she widow's clothes for the rest of her life.
Except for one of her son Tad's birthday parties, he requested that she come out of mourning for the day to celebrate with him, and she wore a purple dress. I believe it was light purple with black stripes. It was on display at the Smithsonian for a little while, but it's a delicate artifact, so I think it got put back into storage. We've got one pretty straightforward question that we've seen on a couple of fronts. How old was John Wilkes Booth?
He was 26.
Not very old. Definitely.
He was a young man.
Definitely a young man. Let's see, 2 questions in a row of why did Lincoln not have a security guard with him from Ava, and Luis wanted to know why the guards did not help. You've got a good answer to this. Would you like to?
Okay.
Would you like to share it?
So President Lincoln's assassination was the first ever assassination of a president in our country, and so the Secret Service and presidential security, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist back then. It was wartime, so there were guards who were assigned to keep their eye on him, but he actually didn't really like to be surrounded by security a lot, and so he would often leave the house before his security detail had arrived to escort him places. At the theater that night, he didn't have a guard. There was a policeman who was supposed to be keeping an eye on him that night. The policeman was not in the theater, and there's some debate as to why that was. The policeman said that Lincoln had dismissed him, said, "Hey, I'm here now, I'm good, have a good night." Others suspect that the policeman may have just sort of gotten a little bored and wanted to go do something else. The policeman was never fired or tried.
Well, he was fired later in life for
Yeah,
being
but not
terrible
for-
at his job
but
in
not
other
for this
ways,
instance.
right? Unless it was something where he was also, so traumatized from the assassination. Like so many people were, a lot of people's lives were ruined who were not in the Lincoln family.
The other thing is, if any of you have been to Washington and have visited the White House, you'll know that it's quite a process to get inside.
Mhm.
You have to submit your name and your information ahead of time, so you get checked out before you even get here. Then you have to wait in line, and then you go through security, and you're not supposed to bring anything with you. And
you can't take pictures.
You can't
except in
take
designated
pictures.
areas.
And, they barely let you take your keys into the building. That was not at all how it was during President Lincoln's time in the White House. You could knock on the door and ask to see the president, and you would be accepted inside, and you could wait to see the president. There were a lot of people doing that, so you might not actually get to see him that day, but you were welcome to try. And so the idea that anyone could go to the White House and try and have a meeting with the president, and he especially was very good about listening to the common person's dilemmas and trying to help people when he could. And so people would go to the White House for jobs. They would go because they were having neighborly disputes here in Washington. They would go because, their family member was fighting in the war and they needed some favor to try and get them supplies or get them back from across some line or something. And so the president was just so much more accessible to the average citizen than he is today.
Or than he would ever, the president
Ever
would
be
ever be
again.
after the assassination. It really did change the way we think about the security of our leaders.
So, and that's also kind of why nobody stopped John Wilkes Booth from going in the box. So if you think about it, if you think the average citizen from Washington could just go see the president if they wanted to, then of course a famous young up-and-coming actor would be allowed to say hello to the president at the theater.
Whose work Lincoln admired. Lincoln had seen him perform and
Thought he was good.
thought he was good. They're probably, one of the questions that our on-site interpreters often ask is, if Booth's card had been presented to Lincoln, would Lincoln have let his assassin in? Probably.
Yeah, maybe.
It might have been, if not, it would just be because he's watching a show right then, but not, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to see John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah, it's accessibility to the president has changed so much since this event. But that's why there was no security for him at that time.
Now, Alex, we've got quite a few questions about what happened to Lincoln between when he was shot and when he passed away, and how long that was, if he had any last words, if he was conscious. Can you tell us what was going on with Lincoln during that time?
So before John Wilkes Booth came into the box, Mary were holding hands, and apparently Mary said, "Do you think Miss Harris will be offended to see us so affectionate?" And apparently Lincoln said, "No, don't worry about it.
She'll think nothing of us.
She'll think nothing of it." And those very well may have been his last words. After John Wilkes Booth shot the president immediately lost consciousness, and he never spoke or awoke again after that. He did not die right away, so he was alive but unconscious. A couple were able to get into the box. One of them actually climbed up onto stage and was hoisted from the stage into the box, like over the railing. They immediately realized that the president's wounds were mortal, that he would not survive, and their first order of business was to get him out of the theater. It was not going to be appropriate for the president to die in a theater that night. So they sort of cleared some room. They assembled several men to carry the president. And remember, President Lincoln was really tall, so it took like several guys to carry the unconscious president out across the back of the balcony. Here, I'll show you the picture again so you can visualize this. carried him out of the box. They carried him across the back balcony, down a spiral staircase, out onto the street. At this point, they didn't know where they were going to take him. Doctors said that he would not survive the carriage ride back to the White House. And so they were like, well, we can't have him die on the floor of a theater and we can't have him die in a carriage. So where will we go? And across the street, directly across the street in the Peterson boarding house, a guy was reading a book and he heard the commotion out in the on the street. And he looked out, he saw the unconscious president and he said, bring him in here. And so they did. And so they carried Lincoln into the Peterson, straight back into the back bedroom, which happened to be empty. They laid him in this small bed. He was actually too tall for the bed, so they had to lay him diagonally across it. And there he lay until 7:22 the next morning when he finally died.
Lots of people are asking how many people were in the theater that night.
I love this question. So today in Ford's Theater, we seat about 650. Back in 1865, there were about 1,700 people in the theater. So as we discussed earlier, the family circle was packed full of people, all squished in on their bench seats. And then the other thing that was different was we didn't have these cushioned seats that are stuck to the floor like we have today. There were just loose little wooden chairs like that one that we think Mary was sitting in. And so they were able to pack in a whole lot more people in the orchestra level and in the dress circle and up in the family circle than we're able to fit in today. They also didn't have fire codes in the same way that we do today. And, you know, their whole...
And theaters caught on fire quite a bit.
But, you know, so So the way that they fit crowds of people into buildings was a lot different than how we do it today. But so there were 1,700 people in the theater that night, and also that means that 1,700 people saw John Wilkes Booth leap out of the box, make a declaration on stage, and escape off into the night. So there was no doubt about who did this. It was quite clear quite soon that John Wilkes Booth was the man who shot the president.
But just because of the way that he timed it, you know, for the laugh line of the show, and there was only one actor on stage, and he was fast. But by the time people understood what had happened, apart from just a select couple of people like Mary Lincoln, and there was a man in the front row who understood what was going on, everybody thought it was part of the play or
they didn't
something.
hear the gunshot. There was much confusion. And also remember, this is the first time that a president has ever been assassinated. So this is an unfathomable event. You can't even imagine how unexpected this would be to that audience. And you know, they recognized this actor, John Wilkes Booth, and he was this part of the show. What was that pop? What was that bang? Did they drop something backstage? And it wasn't until, you know, Mary was screaming and stop that man and the president has been shot that people started putting it all together. And that only took a couple minutes, seconds. You know, but that reaction time, that slight lag is what gave Booth his head start.
We have NLE wants to know if anyone can sit in the box where Lincoln was sitting.
No, not today. Today it is space. So when you come visit Ford's Theater, no one sits there today, but you can go and you can look into it and you can see how it was all around. And we've restored it to look as it did that night. So with the decoration, with the flags and the portrait of George Washington and how the furniture is arranged in there, all of that is based on the crime scene investigation photographs that Matthew Brady took.
Do we want to take some of our YouTube questions? We've been getting a ton of questions on Twitter. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, these are great.
Ethan on Twitter actually wanted to know if I know the Muffin Man, and no, I don't, but I know where he lives. All
right. Okay, so we have a question from Thornton Class.
Ooh.
If Lincoln had not been assassinated, how do you think things would have been different after the Civil War? This is an amazing history what if. And it's one of those questions that no one can answer definitively, of course, because it's all hypothetical, but it's a great way to sort of explore Lincoln's leadership, the types of decisions he made, how he made those decisions. What do you think would have if he hadn't died?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question for students, but one thing that I can say is that a lot of his contemporaries noted that he was the best friend that the Confederacy had in Reconstruction, because he really wanted to bind up the nation's wounds, as he said in his second inaugural. He really just wanted the Union to be a Union again. Mm-hmm. And so I think that a lot of the Confederate and Union tensions that remained after the war, just my own personal opinion, I think that under Lincoln's leadership, if he'd had another almost 4 years to help the nation through, that people's goodwill towards each other would have returned more quickly.
When the Civil War was ending and the Confederacy had lost, there were a couple ways that people could move forward from that. One option would have been to punish the Confederates, right? To prosecute all of their leaders, to take away their horses, take away their land, glorious army taking over the land that they've conquered, right? Lincoln didn't want that, and he made that very clear in his second inaugural address. He said, with malice toward none, with charity for all, right? So he really, he made a point of identifying the Union and the northern states as also having fault in this. He made the Civil War the entire country's problem. Mm-hmm. And so his was going to be to move forward together. The Civil War was something that pitted brother against brother, quite literally. Families were divided by this. Like, one brother would go fight for the Union and the other brother would go fight for the Confederacy, and ne'er to speak again. And he really wanted to restore those relationships and restore, Union, unified. Mm-hmm. That's what he was all about. And without his leadership and without his judgment and his patience, I think that, Reconstruction was a lot harder than been, and that some of the tensions are left unresolved longer than they might have been. And one of our hosts, Field Trip, actually answers this question at the end of our virtual field trip as well. And, he suspected that, perhaps the civil rights movement of the 1960s would have happened sooner had Lincoln lived. It's a really interesting hypothetical question, and I encourage you to discuss it with your classes. What do you think, given Lincoln's leadership, what do you think he would have done had he...
And I've got a couple of related questions from our March 26th program that we were not able to get to, but they are really along these same lines of things that your class can investigate together. One was, what would have been like if Lincoln had never been president, so different than if he hadn't been assassinated.
Oh, wow.
And that's from Micah at Rineyville Elementary School. So if he'd never been elected, not running in 1860, on the Democratic side, there was John C. Breckinridge, who had been the vice president under Buchanan, who was the 15th president of the United States. Not a very good president, just sort of objectively, according to all lists by scholars ever. He's really always towards the bottom because he really set the country up for civil war by just pushing it off and being like, I'm just gonna keep standing over here until the next guy comes in, and then that can be his problem. And that's exactly what happened.
It was.
Or William Seward would have been on the newly founded Republican ticket. He was fairly close second to Lincoln in the Electoral College votes, or I think
That's really interesting because then, then he became Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
So Lincoln surrounded himself with a direct rival.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about Lincoln surrounded himself with advisors on a cabinet who were comprised of people who had been his competitors.
And William Seward, by all accounts, was really upset at not winning. And he was far more progressive than Lincoln was. He was very outspoken about being an abolitionist. So he was, whereas Lincoln was like, I don't want to expand slavery, William Seward was like, we need to end slavery. Slavery is stupid and I hate it. And he was very polarizing because he was, the people in the Confederacy were far more anti-Seward than they were anti-Lincoln. With Lincoln, they just suspected that he might try to end this whole slavery thing. So I don't know what would have happened with that. I can tell you that John C. Breckinridge was later kicked out of the Senate, because then he went on to be a senator when he lost, for treason, for joining the Confederate Army. So if he had been president of the whole United States, I can't begin to speculate in an education about what would have happened, apart from it probably would have been bad.
We would not be the country we are today if President Lincoln had not been president. It would be so profoundly different.
And then there was a related question that Miss Proctor's class was wondering, if Lincoln hadn't won re-election, who would have been president? And this was pretty straightforward. It was going to be George B. McClellan, one of Lincoln's former generals, because he almost won the election as it was. And then what would have immediately happened to the country was McClellan was running on a platform of, we just need to end this bloody war with a negotiated peace, which meant ending the war and everybody can keep their slaves in the Confederacy. That's what the party's platform was.
Wow.
So after that, I don't know. I don't have a way to. I don't know what would have happened to the country, like when slavery would have ended, if it would have ended, what would have happened just to everybody. But that was their political platform moving forward, and Lincoln did not think he was going to win re-election.
Very narrowly won, actually.
And it was only won because John C. Fremont from California pulled out of the election. He was like the third-party candidate. He pulled out at fairly the last minute because McClellan was going to win, and John C. Fremont was more, what was his, the Radical Democracy Party, I believe, and they were very much radical in their democracy. So he was more Lincoln-y than Lincoln at the time. And what Lincoln did a very good job of was waiting for the country to sort of catch up with what he felt needed to happen in terms of emancipating the slaves. Like, Lincoln was probably ready to emancipate the slaves before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but he didn't want to just be like, guess what, America, I know you're not ready for this, but this is happening.
Well, that speaks a lot to his leadership, as he knew that he couldn't just make decisions without any public support, because then, then it would just crumble out from under him. So he took his time, and he really had to weigh his decision making, and he listened to all of these people who disagreed with him. He really weighed everyone's opinions, and he made these moves when the country was ready for them, and that that speaks a lot to his wisdom and his leadership. He had to separate his personal feelings from the work he was doing, because he knew that the people had to support it, because that's what democracy is about.
There's one question I'm really excited to answer.
Okay.
Since we only have a few minutes left. Beth from Miss Gillick's class wants to know if there were any kids in the theater. And in fact, we know that there were at least some. Peanut John Burroughs was holding John Wilkes Booth's horse in the back alley. He worked at the theater. He sold peanuts at the theater, which is why they called him Peanuts John. But there was a man named, a 5-year-old named Samuel J. Seymour, and you can see him on, he's available on YouTube, basically, from the 1956 game show I've Got a Secret. And if you just, I think that actually we're going to share a link with you on Twitter. But as a 96-year-old man, he appears on this game show, and people have to guess what his secret is. And his secret was that he saw John Wilkes Booth assassinate President Lincoln, and he was the last surviving witness. At that time, he was the only person still alive who had witnessed it with his own two eyes.
And that was so he was on this TV show in 1956, and he was 96 years old.
He passed away a couple months later.
And so because of television and because of YouTube, we now in 2015 can watch this last surviving witness of this huge event.
And it's an interesting look into the 50s, too, for those of us who were not there. So teachers, be aware, if you show it to your class, it's great. And the program is presented by Winston Cigarettes. And at the end, everybody gets some tobacco.
It's a different time.
It's just different.
The world continues to change.
Mm-hmm. Do we want to check on our YouTube chat?
Okay.
We've got some more.
We have a great... Okay, so Roslyn Burke asks, how did everyone... newly freed slaves, the South, the Union, everyone react to Lincoln's assassination. We have actually just launched a new website called Remembering Lincoln that addresses exactly that question. So what the website is a digital collection, a digital archive of primary source responses. So paper headlines, diary entries, general's orders. So one of our favorites is this letter that was passed among a family, and in the original letter, the author writes, "Weep, weep, weep," and he talks about his grief about this national tragedy. And then on the envelope of the letter, like in the next generation, they wrote a note about, this was my father's response, and, our hearts are broken, and they like pass it on to another member of the family. Conversely, there's a newspaper headline from deep in the Confederate, glorious news, President Lincoln assassinated. And there's several incorrect facts in this headline also, so it's a really interesting study in verifying your news sources, because in it also claims that Seward was assassinated, which, as we discussed, he was attacked, but the assassination did not succeed. He survived. But you see how there were parts of the country that were rejoicing in this. And there's general's orders from a regiment posted in California. So, this affected the entire country. And in it, he declares that any troops discovered to be reacting inappropriately, so if they're being at all jovial about this or making any jokes or saying anything that could be construed as anti-Lincoln, they will be immediately arrested. And so you can see how the reactions really, varied from deeply personal grief to sort of civic statements, and but you should definitely check out Remembering Lincoln.
I'm going to try to get as many quick little one-word answers. People wanted to know if Booth's family owned slaves. Thrisha would like to know, and they did not. In fact, most of Booth's family were staunchly Unionist. Asim wants to know if the doctor that treated Lincoln was rewarded for trying to save his life. I don't believe that there was any reward in that process.
Didn't he get his cufflinks?
There were some souvenirs that were passed out, such as locks of hair, to people who were key players. He may have gotten the cufflinks. I don't know about that. A couple people asked about ticket prices for Ford's Theater at the time.
Okay, so the family circle was 25 cents. The orchestra was...
No idea about the orchestra. It was $10 for fancy box seats, right?
I think it was $10 for fancy box seats. $5 for the dress circle?
I don't know about the dress circle.
You should look that up.
We know it started at 25 cents for the of that we're fairly certain, because if you go to our theater today, there's a sign out front still that says Family Circle 25 cents. I think that's got to be our last question.
All right.
We can answer the rest that were on Twitter. We'll be online responding to you individually. But thank you all so much for joining us again today. And again, you can always email us at education@fords.org, and we're happy to provide you as many resources as we can come up with. Don't forget to ring your bells tomorrow at 8 a.m. Eastern Time.
And come to visit us online at fords.org. We have a lot of stuff going on today and tomorrow. This is just one of the events planned, and there's going to be a commemorative performance event tonight that will also be simulcast. Mm-hmm. So we would love to have you join us virtually if you can't join us in person. And if you are around town, please come join us on the street.
There's a lot to see, a lot of big hoop skirts.
Some big hoop skirts.
Well, there are more hoop skirts than you'd see on a normal Tuesday.
It's pretty exciting.
It is very exciting.
So thank you so much for joining us. Email us at education@fords.org. And we are so glad that we could do this with you today.
Bye. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.